Hello, I'm Dr. Sanku Lewis, and I'm going to talk about a Lacanian framework for Taekwondo practice, in which I'm going to describe how we can use Lacan's idea of the three orders for martial arts pedagogy. I gave this presentation recently at the Youngsan University's Second International Taekwondo Conference, and this was co-hosted by IACT, the International Academic Conference of Taekwondo. I also presented at both these conferences last year, the first International Academic Conference of Youngsan University and the IACT conference in Stanford University. Last year's IACT conference at Stanford University was streamed, and the streamed conference was also recorded and then made available online. But what I found was that the quality of sound was not that great. So this year, when this current conference, the Second International Academic Conference at Youngsan University was hosted, it was also streamed and recorded. But I thought that maybe the sound quality might not be as good as well because it goes through the Zoom platform. So I decided, since I have the PowerPoint slides ready and I have the script for this presentation ready, I can just as well record it myself to ensure that the quality of sound is better. There has also been several people that have asked me for my presentation. So I decided that making a personal presentation might be a quicker way to give the presentation to them, and this is also a way for my own students to see it. Martial arts can be arranged on a spectrum from esoteric spirituality based on myths and legends on the one end to practical combatives and real-life violence on the other end, from expressions of intangible cultural heritage to self-defense. Often, such divergent aspects may be present in a single martial art. Hence, it can be difficult to understand how different parts of a martial art fit together into a coherent whole. The three orders theory of French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan may offer a paradigm for us to theorize about martial arts. Now, I must confess, I am not an expert on Lacan and I am not a psychoanalyst. Rather, I am appropriating and definitely simplifying this idea from Lacan's corpus as a way to organize our understanding of martial arts and in particular Taekwondo pedagogy. One of Lacan's pivotal ideas, which crystallized over many years, is that of the imaginary symbolic real. I believe that Lacan's orders of the imaginary, symbolic, and real can function as a good framework to think about Taekwondo, similar to previous framework I've used, such as the low variables to high variables sparring drill framework, which I shared at the 2019 International Academic Conference for Taekwondo at Stanford University, which is part of my paper on the teleology of sparring in ITF Taekwondo. I'm starting my theory on the assumption that the purpose, or at least a purpose, of martial arts is the preparation for surviving real violence. In other words, self-defense. There are, of course, many other goals that martial arts systems may have, such as personal development, health and well-being, and competition, and so on, which I will not focus on here. Today, I will start from the assumption that a goal of Taekwondo is self-defense, since this is at least one definition found within Taekwondo literature. It claims to be the Korean art of self-defense. How successful it is as such is another matter. Let me return now to Jacques Lacan's three orders theory. I will briefly explain what the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real are, and in each case I will make an application to martial arts. Imaginary refers to how we imagine ourselves and others to be. It refers to our worldview, the way we see and interpret reality. Lacan's idea of the imaginary is equated with the mirror stage in childhood development, when an infant, between about 6 months and 18 months of age, starts to recognize that it is the object it sees in the mirror. This, the psychoanalysts argued, is when the ego is formed, and it resonates with Freud's concept of identification. The child looks up at its parents and siblings and identify in them an ideal ego, a kind of future ego it hopes to become. The mirror can therefore be understood metaphorically, so that there need not be an actual mirror. The child may see themselves reflected in other children, their siblings or adults. In his later thought, Lacan did not restrict the mirror stage only to the infant, but extended it into adulthood as something that continues throughout our lives. I propose that in the martial arts, the imaginary is the image we have about what a martial artist is, what someone who is practicing martial arts is like. Note, I'm emphasizing both the act of martial arts as an object and the person engaging in martial arts as the subject. In modern times, the image is highly influenced by popular media. The image of a martial artist may be based on the myths of Shaolin monks, like these monk-like warriors, Zen practicing martial arts, and characters from movies, such as Daniel LaRusso and Mr. Miyagi in The Karate Kid, or the many characters played by Jean-Claude Van Damme, Jackie Chan, Jet Li, Donnie Yen, and Michelle Yeoh. Of course, the imagined martial artist need not stay within the realm of cinema, Hollywood or East Asian cinema, but can also be based on combat sport athletes from WWE or UFC, and actual historical characters such as Masoyama and Bruce Lee. Finally, for most martial art initiates, their immediate image of what a martial artist is often their personal martial arts instructors and seniors. It is not for naught that the Korean term for instructor, sabomnim, in Taekwondo literally translates as a teacher that ought to be imitated, a teacher model. In all these cases, we have a type of idealization of the martial artist. In other words, a fantasy. Sometimes martial arts instructors, the masters and grandmasters, may unfortunately promote this fantasy of themselves, but often it is the students themselves who idealize their instructors. The idealization may simply be the result of perceiving, and correctly so, the big gap between their own skill level compared to the skill level of their instructors. This gap, which at first may seem quite insurmountable, causes the student to put the instructor on a pedestal. This ideal then functions as a goal to strive for, and while it may be a fantasy, it is not wholly bad. Myths and fantasies can be inspirational. Hence, martial arts philosopher Alan Back at the International Academic Taekwondo Conference in 2019 presented a paper in favor of myths in martial arts. There is, of course, the danger that the fantasy may be mistaken for reality. Many new martial artists are lured into taking up a martial art by Hollywood depictions of a lone hero who single-handedly beats up a gang of people, or other such impossible feats. Such a false sense of prowess can be really dangerous. On the other end of the spectrum is Lacan's real. It is a bit tricky to give a simple definition of what Lacan meant by the real, but for our purpose, I propose we understand it simply as that which objectively is before our interpretation of it, Or, as Lacan defined it in one of his many definitions, the real is what does not depend on my idea of it. In other words, reality before it is filtered by our senses and worldviews. This means that the real is never fully knowable, because our subjective interpretation skews objective reality. Furthermore, the real is too complex to be fully understood. For our discussion on martial arts, we will refer here to what happens during actual violence. What is a real violent conflict or real violent encounter like? How do trained practitioners really act during a violent encounter? How do untrained people act during such encounters? How is the human nervous system affected by stress and adrenaline during these violent conflicts? How are muscle control and coordination affected during a life-threatening encounter? How is competition fighting different from street fighting, both psychologically and strategically? How is a duel, such as a street fight, a squabble at the pub, a brawl on the playground, different from a predatory criminal attack on an unsuspecting victim? Some of these questions can be, to a lesser or greater degree, studied, and there are professionals in military, security, and defense occupations who have taken the pains to attempt to research such questions. The problem remains, however, that even when we have analyzed the data, the subjective lived experience of violence is different from person to person and from violent encounter to violent encounter. One simply can't predict all the variables that come into play during a violent encounter. One can't know when exactly you will be attacked, whether the floor will be hard or slippery, whether it will be dark, whether there will be weapons involved, how many attackers you will face, and so on. At best, we can hope for an approximation of likely possibilities. Moving on to the symbolic order. Lacan's symbolic refers to all the societal institutions and systems that are in place to mediate between the imaginary and the real. For example, in a country that sees itself as a safe democracy, such systems may include a government and judiciary that ensures regular, free, and fair elections. Arts context, I propose that the symbolic is the martial arts system with its syllabus and training practices and associated institutions. The proper martial arts system functions as a conduit for understanding and preparing for the real. The system ought to help disillusion the martial arts practitioner from the imaginary. As the practitioner is training in the martial arts system, they learn to distinguish between the imaginary and the real. They learn that the cinematic depictions of martial arts are often simply fantasy. Yet they also realize that the abilities of their instructors and seniors are not mystical, but simply the result of hard, persistent, and awfully long training. In summary, we are talking about a martial arts system that claims to be a self-defense system, such as the case of Taekwondo. First, such a martial arts system should disillusion the imaginary. Whenever a martial arts system promotes wrong ideas of what real violent encounters are like, or even teach impractical techniques or strategies for facing real violence, it is failing to dispel the falsehoods of the imaginary and rather strengthens the imaginary. Second, a good martial arts system should provide a sensible path towards preparing for the real. There should be a proper pedagogy, a syllabus in place that can guide the practitioner from being completely unprepared for the real or for real violence to be reasonably prepared for real violence. It is important to note that it is not impossible to be absolutely prepared for the real, because the real is impossible to fully comprehend and fully predict. Even the most experienced combatants do not have a 100% success rate. Real violence is simply too unpredictable and chaotic. Nevertheless, one can train to improve your chances. A good martial arts system should have a progressive syllabus that aims towards the most likely success. This should include what is now commonly called reality-based training against resisting partners. Third, the imaginary is not without value. A good martial arts system engages the imaginary in a productive way to inspire the student to grow beyond themselves, beyond their current technical and physical abilities, towards a type of ideal. Mastery in the martial arts may result in a practitioner doing feats that appear fantastical. However, this is the result of years of training and hard work and dedication. When a practitioner sees their instructors do such skills, it can inspire the practitioner to want to achieve the same level of proficiency as the instructor, or maybe even go beyond that of the instructor. Therefore, the imaginary has an important motivating function. And finally, because it is impossible to definitively prepare for the real, the ultimate training goal is a type of unattainable ideal. This is where the imaginary plays an important function. The imaginary provides the idealistic goal. It's the goal of the perfection of technique that is aimed at in martial arts. Without this drive towards this perfect technique, the martial arts could never aim high enough to prepare for the impossibility of the real. Preparing for the real is impossible, and achieving the perfection projected by the imaginary is also impossible. Yet it is the striving towards that impossible ideal, towards perfect technique, that best prepares the martial artist for the real or for real violence. Thank you. After I gave the presentation at the conference, I was offered a little bit of additional time to expand on my ideas, and I was also asked 2 questions. Now, I can't remember the exact wording of those questions, but I will paraphrase them and then just give a general response similar to the ones that I gave at the conference. One person asked whether martial art practice is really for self-defense. If that is the case, why not get a gun? A gun is much more efficient than trying to do hand-to-hand combat. My answer to this is that it really depends on the context. Now, I started practicing martial arts in South Africa, and in South Africa, martial arts is really still practiced, not mainly as a sport or as a type of ascetic spiritual development, but for self-defense, because South Africa has a very high crime rate, and especially a high violent crime rate. This is quite different from the situation here in Korea where I live. When I came to Korea and started teaching martial arts here, the Koreans asked me, why am I so violent? I couldn't understand what they meant, because when I started teaching, especially teaching self-defense techniques, I taught the types of techniques that I needed in the context where I came from, South Africa. It took me a couple of years, having lived in Korea, to realize that Korea, by comparison, is not a dangerous place at all, and the type of techniques that I was teaching my students are not relevant in this society. Furthermore, while guns may be much better at defense than self-defense through hand-to-hand combat, guns are not always accessible. In many countries, criminals have guns, but the average citizen does not. Now, I'm not saying that you can successfully defend yourself with your bare hands against an attacker with a gun. It's unlikely. It's not impossible, but it's quite unlikely. What I am saying is that we don't always have access to guns, and we need, therefore, to have a system that can help us defend ourselves in moments of a violent crime. The other question I got was regarding my idea that it's impossible to fully prepare for the real. And the person suggested that there are indeed statistical probabilities that we can prepare for. There's research that's been done, and based on that research we can have a good sense of the type of attacks that we might get and how to prepare for these things. And to this I agree. So it depends. It's about the idea of what the real is, how I use this term based on Jacques Lacan's theory. The real is reality with all of its chaos and complexity. In other words, we don't know what the real is truly like. We cannot predict it fully. The best we can do is an approximation. And that is indeed what I'm suggesting, is that the system, the martial arts system, or the symbolic, is there for us, gathered based on evidence, based on data, and we use that system to prepare us as much as possible for real violence. So although reality is unpredictable, through training and through proper research, we can create a type of approximation and at least train towards that approximation of what the reality is likely to be, of what a violent encounter is likely to be. However, the moment we think that we are fully prepared for real violence, then we are moving back into the imaginary. That is a fantasy. One can never be fully 100% for actual real violence. The best we can say is that we are well prepared, we are reasonably prepared, and our training is based on a sense of what reality is like. This presentation is part of a theme of research I've been doing, and it's based on the assumption that a goal of martial art is self-defense, but also that most martial arts are really inadequate at teaching self-defense. So in my previous I-ACT presentation and also in this I-ACT presentation, I am suggesting that we should really look again at the syllabus and see if the syllabus is doing the job it's supposed to do. Is this syllabus actually guiding a person from being completely unprepared for a real self-defense or violent encounter to being reasonably prepared? I do believe that the martial arts can indeed be used to teach self-defense, but it can only do that if the martial arts system is honest. Is it honest about what the real violence is like? Is it honest about the validity of its current arsenal of techniques to work in real violence? So that is the type of work I'm doing at, and that's the goal of this presentation too, is many martial arts is living in this fantasy, the imaginary. And therefore it's important for these martial arts to take an honest internal look at what it is teaching, at its techniques, at its teaching methodologies, and so on, and decide whether it's true to the reality, it's true to what really works and really can work. There is definitely anecdotal evidence that many martial arts have equipped people in order to defend themselves in real situations. So based on this anecdotal evidence, we can say that martial arts can be used for self-defense. But of course, we can make it better. We can really streamline the process, really make the process more sensible, more logical, and make it based less on tradition and more on reality, more on facts and research and current research as well. I think that certain frameworks or different frameworks, such as the three orders theory by Jacques Lacan, can give us an insight of the nature of the problem. Part of that nature of the problem is that there's a fantasy, the imaginary of what real violence is like. And because the fantasy is so strong, oftentimes the symbolic, the syllabus is not honest to reality. It's not really able to take the person from the fantasy, from the imaginary, closer to reality. But I also think that the traditional martial arts got something right, and it is the ideal. And the ideal is part of that imaginary, because the ideal is impossible for us to achieve. What ideal? The ideal that every technique I do, I execute it perfectly. And what does that mean? It means that it will be effective every time I do it. Now, this is an ideal. It's like the holy grail of martial arts. And trying to achieve this is impossible. Nobody I know has achieved that level of absolute perfection of each technique. Yet all martial artists tend to work towards that goal, even though it is unattainable. And it might seem silly at first. It might seem like a stupid waste of time, but I think there's a truth in there. And the truth is this: to be fully prepared for real violence is impossible, because we just don't know all the variables at play. Therefore, we should train in such a way that every technique we do will be perfect. And it is this type of mentality, this working towards the ideal, that I believe is the type of mentality we need in order to be most likely successful in a real violent encounter. We have to train in such a way that every time we do our technique, we do it perfectly. We do it at the best of our ability. We do it in a way that it is very likely, definitely going to work. Of course, that is impossible. It's not likely to work every time. Nevertheless, it's that mental attitude, that focus towards the ideal, which we need in order to be successful, or most likely successful, in an actual violent encounter. But I also think that the traditional martial arts got something right, and it is the ideal. And the ideal is part of that imaginary, because the ideal is impossible for us to achieve. What ideal? The ideal that every technique I do, I execute it perfectly. And what does that mean? It means that it will be effective every time I do it. Now, this is an ideal. It's like the holy grail of martial arts. And trying to achieve this is impossible. Nobody I know has achieved that level of absolute perfection of each technique. Yet all martial artists tend to work towards that goal, even though it is unattainable. And it might seem silly at first. It might seem like a stupid waste of time, but I think there's a truth in there. And the truth is this: to be fully prepared for real violence is impossible, because we just don't know all the variables at play. Therefore, we should train in such a way that every technique we do will be perfect. And it is this type of mentality, this working towards the ideal, that I believe is the type of mentality we need in order to be most likely successful in a real violent encounter. We have to train in such a way that every time we do our technique, we do it perfectly. We do it at the best of our ability. We do it in a way that it is very likely, definitely going to work. Of course, that is impossible. It's not likely to work every time. Nevertheless, it's that mental attitude, that focus towards the ideal, which we need in order to be successful, or most likely successful, in an actual violent encounter. This then is where I will end. Stay healthy, train hard. See you next time. Bye bye.